All right, to wrap this all up, I'm joined by Ted Starkey, and who's been covering the NHL for NHL, AHL, is an editor, multiple other. It's hard to introduce Ted Starkey, but so the only thing I will say is that Ted is one of the few people I've been able to interview who's got a book behind me over here. He's got the AHL book about chasing the dream, which is also very relevant because I cover the AHL. We're going to wrap this up with Ted by talking about some of the small market teams. But before we do that, Ted, how are you doing?
I'm good, good. Hockey's here. It's a good time of year, you know. You have AHL's kicking off, NHL's kicking off, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, it is. It is really exciting that the season's around the corner, and to start the season, we're starting with a bang on with this with ice time where we already talked to Houston and Atlanta. We talked to some of the big markets here. We didn't talk about some of the small markets the league might look at, and I know the whole thing is that everyone's talking about the big markets that the league wants to target. You look at Houston, you look at Atlanta, and there's a good case to be made for some of the other cities out there. And I think it's actually makes more sense for the NHL to look at some of the other cities. You can have a list in your head, whether it be Cleveland, Milwaukee, Kansas City, those types of cities that are out there, or even somewhere in Canada like Quebec City. But I'll turn it over to you and ask, what do you think is the best case for a smaller market or a mid-sized market for the NHL to look at for maybe Team 34, where they go to 33 first and then they go to 34 with one of these teams?
I think probably the one that would be stick out is in Austin, because I think if Houston does not get a team, and there's some, probably the big question with Houston is which ownership group will get it because there's two pretty good ownership groups. But Austin seems to be one that's on their radar. It's a up and coming city. There's only one other pro team in town, and that's MLS, Austin FC. I think they kind of see that as kind of a Las Vegas too. That would be like the big team in town besides, obviously the Texas Longhorns, college. But I think they see that. I think other ones you can see Cincinnati is a possibility. They've shown some interest. Uh, I think you see New Orleans. The governor has shown some interest. And like you're saying, Quebec City. There's a couple. I think there's some pockets of cities that are good hockey towns that for one reason or another they may or may not be on their list. Probably the biggest one right now is having $2 billion to buy a team. You need to have someone who's willing to invest, and that probably means building a new arena. A lot of being able to take some financial losses initially. But I think the NHL has a pretty big footprint, and I think there's if you have a good team and good ownership, it's pretty portable of where you could put a team. You just need some financial support. You need kind of a plan with an arena that makes money for everybody. And so, there's a list of teams, like you were saying, Kansas City's always been a possibility. They've never put a team in the Sprint Center. Cleveland, they're obviously building a new football stadium. They're not sure what they're going to do with the current arena right next to the Cleveland Guardians Park. So it's a lot of possibilities.
So yeah, and what's interesting is the teams you mentioned at first were Austin, New Orleans, and the mid-sized markets that I originally thought of are in the Midwest, where you look at Cleveland, Milwaukee, uh, Kansas City is another one where they're it's interesting because it feels like there's a better case for a team there because you have already the fan base there. Cleveland, for example, already has the Cleveland Monsters
Right.
there, which are one of the better AHL teams or one of the more better selling AHL teams. Certainly, you have the infrastructure in place. You have an arena there where you have the I know that it's an older arena, but you have the arena at least to kick off the ground running. And I wonder what why the guardrails for I mean, it seems like the NHL wants to expand again into those southern markets where they went into Florida back in the day. I mean, they went back in the day to California. So you're looking at the Sun Belt where it's Florida, Texas, Arizona, and now again, when you look at part three, it's or whatever part we're up to, Houston, Atlanta. And I wonder why not again the Midwest? Why would they not? Why would they look away from that? Because I think it it makes a lot of sense when you have already the infrastructure, all those things, except for maybe an owner in place. Although with some of those markets, even Milwaukee, you can look at maybe there's a big interest, someone who has been part of one of the teams nearby that wants to build a team there. You have a good interest. You have a lot of potential owners there. So I wonder why not the Midwest again.
I think it's interesting because like a team, a place like Kansas City, Kansas City in the past obviously had interest in the Penguins, they had interest in the Islanders because they have an existing arena, and they've been trying to get a team there for a while. Milwaukee, I know the ownership in the past again has been very interested in bringing an NHL team. Kind of partnering with the Bucks, trying to have them share the arena. Uh, Cleveland, I think, is a little bit more tricky because I think the Blue Jackets they seem to claim a little bit of ownership to it. Obviously, it's a city with great hockey history, like you were saying with the Barons and the Lake Monsters. Uh, and it's interesting because I think it seems a little bit like Cleveland is claiming a little bit of ownership, so there may be a little bit of internal resistance. But then again, it really just takes someone who wants to buy a team. As I said, it's a huge investment now. I mean, the valuations of NHL franchises came out. I think the lowest one was about $1.3 billion. So, the next expansion round, the last one was 750. This one's going to be $2 billion to enter the league. So, and it just seems like with the current favorites, it just seems like there's an ownership group in place willing to pay that much, or at least on paper. It depends on actually raising the money, which is, that's a lot of money to put for an NHL team. But, I think they do make sense. Kansas City is centrally located. It is an area, and plus you'd have a natural rivalry with the Blues. If you look, the Blues are kind of in this empty space where really the closest cities are Chicago and Dallas in terms of rivalries. Milwaukee would be great with Chicago and Minnesota. But it's right now it's basically the NHL was so loath for expansion for a while because you had these teams that were struggling. Obviously Phoenix was struggling. They were concerned about Florida. And now it seems like the NHL is finally stabilized to the point where there's really no weak teams that they need to consider relocating, which, and honestly, that's part of it too, because they want cities for if a team is struggling, needs a new arena, they want to have a place where they can go. And I think they're at the point now where they don't really need that. So, obviously you had Vegas and Seattle come in, and I think, now that the new CBA is signed, they basically are kind of looking to where can we, expand where there's going to be a deep pocketed owner. And I think, obviously the ownership in the past has always been an issue for teams. There have been some interesting uh, cases of teams that weren't well funded. And so I think they're looking for the right owner. And there's enthusiasm for hockey because obviously as a business it's doing very well. The teams, like I said, the teams are being they're highly valued teams now. Teams sold in the millions only about a decade ago, and now they're going for billions and billions of dollars. So. It'll be interesting. I mean, I think there's cases to be made for a lot of cities. It's a growing sport. And I think there's a lot of interest, especially like you said, the Midwest.
Well, yeah, and the interesting thing you mentioned is the league finally has more stability. Or more accurately, they wanted to expand, I think, for a while, but they had to figure out Arizona first. And now that that's out of the way, now that they figured that out in the sense, at least temporarily, where there's no longer this arena mess and all that stuff, and there's a team in Utah, and the 32 teams that are there are pretty stable. Maybe there will be one or two that pop up in the upcoming years that all of a sudden they become an issue, but it seems like 32 is stable, and now it's a matter of when, not if, where they go to 33 instead, or and then 34 from there. We're kind of similar where Vegas came first, then Seattle. I think that's kind of what the NHL is looking at. And it's interesting you mentioned Kansas City, and you mentioned, I mean, yeah, we're talking about these cities that they're not just are they well not just are they good markets, but where they have the infrastructure, they're well located. You met Cleveland earlier. That's a team that you're right next to Pittsburgh or very close to Pittsburgh. You're very close to Columbus, and then you're also pretty close to Detroit too. It's right. You could just slide it right into the, well, I guess it would be the Central Division, or well, Kansas City the same way, where you have Denver also. You put it in the Central Division. It makes a lot of sense. You could slide them in the big picture, and this is not just applicable to the mid-sized market or the smaller market. It looks like the NHL is trying to hit a home run with their new expansion team. Wherever they go, they want to swing big and hit a home run where they're going for that big swing. And it seems like does it seems like they just need a single though, or they just need to get on base with 34. And I wonder about that. Like does because we've seen the downfalls. I think Arizona is an example where Gary Bettman swung big and kept swinging at it. He kept trying to make that market work. Obviously, the ownership was part of the downfall. There's a few other problems that surfaced up, but he kept swinging big for that, and it didn't work out. And I'm wondering, does he just need? Does the NHL just need a base? Say they get a home run in 33. Say they go with Houston, Atlanta, wherever it is. Do they just need to get on base, and that does that work, or is it like, oh no, we need to swing big here?
I think, it's a lot of it is the TV market size. I think, obviously Atlanta has a push with, their network partner with TBS and Turner. And if you look at the history of Atlanta, uh, that between the Flames and the Thrashers, they won two playoff games total. And I think, that's a big part of it because if you don't have a competitive team, same thing happened in Phoenix. The Coyotes made the Western Finals once in their existence. And, if you just don't have a team that's competitive, it's hard in any market. Like you look even like cities like Buffalo now, it's a great hockey town, but if the team doesn't win, you have trouble selling tickets. So
But it
when you
is
go in,
easier though. Like that's the interesting thing is that I think one of the downfalls to swinging big is that when you go to a market like Houston or you go to a market like LA, which was a big issue for football in LA, where there's so many other options for fans, a 500 team is not going to sell. And I think you look at Buffalo, like they haven't been 500 in a while, so it's a little harder to evaluate, but they still sell relatively well because they are the only team in town, or they are the only there's the Bills who play once a week, but you have that where they are the only team in town. So I think that's what I wonder about. Like that getting into a mid-sized market that does help you in that case because like you're going to have a fan base. Even Seattle has not been good since they've started. They've actually been one of the worst franchises since they've started, but they're still selling well because there's no baseball's not in season, and it's not like a baseball rich city as much as the Mariners are doing well now. They're not a city that, oh yeah, like the fans
right.
are going to be disinterested all the time. And then you have football there, but there's no basketball, so you have a steady fan base, and that's what I wonder about a mid-sized market. Do you think it's an easy get on base where let's say you go to Kansas City, there's no other team in town except for, I mean, there's the Chiefs and the Royals, so you have that, but you can get a steady fan base where a 500 team can do well. I wonder about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the appeal with the Austin bid. Like I was saying, there's only a Major League Soccer team in town, obviously, besides college sports. Obviously the Longhorns are big. Yeah, I think it's interesting because, like, they seem to be chasing who they think can actually put together the money. I think that's what they appeal with, Atlanta and Houston. Obviously, Houston's bid is two well-heeled owners who one wants to put them in the Toyota Center, at least for now. The other is probably would have to build their own building. But yeah, and you look at Kansas City. I mean, it's interesting in case for expansion. You have two Kansas City and Quebec have NHL ready buildings already. Obviously Sprint Center's been there for 25 years. They've been trying to, attract a team. They made offers at the Islanders and the Penguins in the past, and they've never been able to land a team. Quebec has a beautiful building. That would certainly be the only team in town. And they haven't been able to basically get someone to bring a team there. And obviously, I think now the price tag is what's going to become the big issue because you really have to have someone who wants, you know, obviously if you're spending 2 billion on a team, you're probably not going to be cheap on the roster. And I think that's kind of the presumption they have. If you're investing this much money, are you going to have a team that's not a cap team? And probably the only question is if you spend the money wisely. Obviously there's a lot of teams who spend close to the cap of the NHL, and they're not very good teams because they don't spend their money. But an expansion team is a great chalkboard for building a team because you can build it however you want. You're not stuck with these contracts that are left over. You're not stuck with mistakes that other teams are. You don't have these two or three, $8 million contracts of guys who are average. You can pick and choose who you want. That's why Vegas did such a great job. Seattle, not as much. I think they didn't quite get the talent level that Vegas did. And so, it's you got to put a good hockey guy in charge once you get the team because you're going to have 112 roughly million to spend in contracts. You can build yourself a really good team if you're smart about it.
It's funny you mentioned the Vegas and Seattle, and you could even go back further where the teams that built well. You look at the early days of expansion, the Flyers and the Islanders, where they built well. The Flyers obviously built to win right away, not right away, but pretty quickly. And the Islanders
Yeah.
built in the long term, and they became a dynasty. And then conversely, the Flames were an expansion team, and they weren't run well. So they relocate
Right.
to from Atlanta to Calgary. So I think yeah, that's the interesting thing is that the big thing is the NHL is going through their checklist. I think money and population are the two big ones, and that's why they're looking for those where it's like those are the big things on their checklist. So the cities that have that immediately are at an advantage versus the ones that don't have that. It's interesting because yeah, even those cities that you I mean mentioned we mentioned them. I have a list of them. It's like Cleveland, Milwaukee. I know Hamilton's kind of in a complicated spot because they're near Toronto and the issues of that, but there's another one with an arena in place as well. So you have that, but you have Kansas City, you have Portland, uh, you have Quebec City. You have these mid markets where there is a good enough population for them, and the question is if they have an owner in place, but you have to imagine that between these groups there is some sort of backing that can be there to support a team. And really, it's just a matter of like not just that they have the money, but they are willing to spend it. Not just everyone talks about the salary cap, but it's building the practice facilities and how the team travels and all those things that add up and really make a difference. I mean, you can tell the teams that spend big use that to their advantage. And I mean, the big things that the ownership groups in Florida now are willing to spend. And because of that, they have that advantage where everyone talks about the taxes and the tax free state. And they have that advantage now because when it comes down to it, they have all the other things already in place, a good culture and stuff like that. I guess we've kind of covered everything. I'll just wrap up with a question I have, which is: it's one thing for these cities to be successful; it's another to become a destination. I wonder what what can turn these cities into a destination, a place where players want to go. Because everyone's talking about, well, everyone wants to go to Florida now because of the no taxes. And back in the day, it was no one wants to go to Florida because there's no fan interest. They're poorly run franchises. So obviously, winning is going to be the big thing for any market, any team that the NHL goes to. But I wonder what can particularly, and really because we've been talking about the mid-sized cities, what can make them a destination where players want to sign there and want to go there.
I mean, I think it's, a lot of it is like you were saying, the winning culture. But like they're looking, more likely they'll end up in the Sun Belt cities. I mean, we also can't rule out at some point a return to Phoenix if, that's kind of got the caveat of if the Suns ownership. I mean, that seemed to be the big thing with Phoenix hockey is they couldn't pair with the Suns were really the driver of the new arena. The old group obviously had its issues and couldn't get an arena built. The one group that probably can is the ownership of the Suns. So I think if they've shown some interest, I'm not sure, they're that interested in a team, but obviously in the past. But I think, it's they players love warm climates. They love to be down south. It's like you were saying with Florida, is they have a great combination now. Both teams are winning. The weather's great. California, obviously, players. If Anaheim gets his act together again, that's gonna be another place. LA is kind of on its way back up. Of the crop, obviously New Orleans, if they ever got a team, that would be a very interesting spot because obviously, that's a it's an interesting city. I'm not sure it's big enough for the NHL, but they've shown interest, and if they have someone willing to kind of take that on, uh, you know, Atlanta would be it's not Atlanta per se. It's kind of the northern suburbs. It's a place where kind of would be a place like Raleigh, where guys could go golfing late in the year. It wouldn't necessarily be downtown. It's kind of a different vibe when you're north that part of the city because it's not, really, it's more suburbs and its own little enclave. Houston, most likely be downtown. That's already it's a very saturated sports market, but it's a very big sports market. Like you were saying, the NHL really, if you look at the top 15 cities in the U.S. in terms of market size, the three that are missing are Atlanta, Houston, and Phoenix. So, obviously market wise, they want that, but you can see a city like New Orleans, people want to go to. Probably Atlanta, like I said, because it's similar to Raleigh. It's a bigger version, but it's also where they're going to be is, you're 45 miles from downtown. So it's not Atlanta per se. And it's going to be interesting, and obviously Phoenix is always, it's a home to a lot of players anyway. If they ever get their stable ownership group, that's obviously going to be an attractive place.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned New Orleans, and I was thinking along with the expansion topic is that whenever a new team comes in, they're going to need an AHL affiliate and an ECHL affiliate,
Yes.
and they're going to need it close by.
Yeah.
So New Orleans is one of those cities that can be an AHL type of city because it is close to Houston or it's close to those other southern markets. It is interesting though, an AHL team in New Orleans because AHL teams are quite young and New Orleans is quite the city. So be interesting to see. Although
Yes.
people said that about Vegas, so you can probably say the same. Like, okay, New Orleans actually would do well in that sense. But that's the other interesting thing is that these teams I think one of the things the league's considering, especially because of the new CBA, where players have to, I'm repeating myself from the other recordings, but they have to play one game before they get called up or down. So none of those AHL shenanigans again, where players get called up and sent back down, like paper transactions. But because of that, I think you're going to see a lot of AHL teams and ECHL teams, for that matter, be close by to their
Right.
NHL affiliates, and that actually helps. We mentioned Cleveland. That helps a team like Cleveland because even if they get rid of their AHL team, there you have Erie is nearby. You have other hockey hotbeds nearby to help with that. But yeah, it is interesting because I think the league's going back to the drawing board here, and they're checking off a bunch of things on their checklist, and I think obviously they're going to look at there's the handful of cities they're looking at that I think they're like, okay, they're inevitably going to go to one of them, but I think there's an easy, you could call it, yeah, just getting on base. And I think for the NHL, like, I think that's something to consider and something that they really should keep in mind, especially if they're going to 34, where you could have a team there. um all right, that's all we got, Ted. Thank you for joining.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks. Have great to be on. Always good to talk about expansion in the AHL.
It's a pleasure getting to talk to you, and hopefully we'll discuss more hockey in general as the season goes on. Have you on in the future, but where just any plugs anywhere we could find you? Obviously, you have a book here in the background. I can't really reach behind me, but you wrote a book about the AHL. You wrote a book about the Washington Capitals, but any plugs you can plug away now?
Oh, I'm joining obviously this season Hockey Hot Stove as a columnist, which is great because it's a great group. I'm glad to be part of it. So I'll be doing a lot, not only on the Caps but the NHL in general. Also a little bit of the AHL. I was down in Hershey last week for the NHL exhibition, and I do touch on the AHL too. Obviously, it's a fun league, and it's funny like you're talking about the NHL. The AHL is getting very stable too. I mean, I know. Hamilton's probably getting a team online soon. So, It'll be interesting to see how that league does because with the change in that league with the 19-year-olds coming in, it's gonna be a lot of fun.
Yeah, it is going to be a lot of fun. And yeah, you talk about I'm kind of keeping close eye on the AHL more so than most hockey fans, just because it's my third season covering the league, and it is you mentioned that, and it's why when it comes to expansion relocation, I keep that in the back of my head, like some of the cities that they're going to have to consider, and they really are going to consider the mid market cities, like again, like I've been listing them like Orlando or you look at Charlotte, where if a team moves to Orlando, maybe Charlotte or Jacksonville's another one that maybe if there's a team in Atlanta, Jacksonville's a very good affiliate, makes a lot of sense. And there's a lot of markets there that they would consider. Maybe I don't know the hockey history there, but Boise would be one that's close enough to Seattle, and with Portland were there. So you it's interesting to just kind of keep an eye on and think about where that league is heading, because they find out, again, the AHL also is like a league that just hasn't had stability in a while, but
Right.
now they have it, and it's like for the first time in a while. But for now, that's all we've got. We hope you enjoyed. This is a longer episode than usual. Got to speak to a lot of people about expansion. Definitely gave me a better perspective on something I've been thinking about for a while. But it's been great. We hope you enjoyed. Make sure to check out all the great work at Hockey Hot Stove. You can find Ted's work, you can find my work there, and we hope you enjoyed. And tune in for throughout the season, which is about to get underway, for plenty of good episodes. Thank you.